Olá, sejam bem-vindos ao programa Fundacentro Entrevista. Hoje traremos a entrevista com Scott Schneider, ex-diretor de Segurança e Saúde Ocupacional do Fundo Norte-Americano de Segurança e Saúde dos Trabalhadores. Scott tem participação histórica na questão do amianto nos Estados Unidos. Essa entrevista foi conduzida pelo tecnologista da Fundacentro, Gustavo Pottker. A iniciativa faz parte das atividades técnico-científicas da instituição, sobre desamiantagem, desenvolvimento de estratégias para difusão de informações para a remoção segura dos materiais contendo amianto de instalações prediais. Acompanhe!
Olá! A Fundacentro desenvolve hoje um projeto chamado Desamiantagem, pesquisando técnicas e metodologias para a remoção do amianto no Brasil. No âmbito do projeto, nós buscamos aprender como se desenvolveu a desamiantagem e a gestão do amianto em diversos países, em seus aspectos técnicos, políticos e administrativos. Espera-se, com isso, formar um referencial para o Brasil. Para isso, nós estamos realizando uma série de entrevistas com especialistas. Para a entrevista de hoje, convidamos o Sr. Scott Schneider, que foi diretor de Saúde e Segurança do Trabalho no Fundo de Saúde e Segurança do Trabalho dos Trabalhadores norte-americanos. Ele nos ajudará a compreender os aspectos técnicos do processo de desamiantagem nos Estados Unidos, nas escolas especialmente, que, embora não tenha banido o amianto, os Estados Unidos possuem um arcabouço legal para o gerenciamento desses materiais. O Sr. Scott Schneider trabalhou com questões de segurança e saúde ocupacional no movimento sindical por mais de 40 anos. Ele trabalhou para o Sindicato dos Carpinteiros, o Instituto dos Trabalhadores para a Segurança e Saúde, o Centro de Pesquisa e Treinamento em Construção e o Fundo de Saúde e Segurança dos Trabalhadores da América do Norte, do qual se aposentou recentemente. Ao longo de sua carreira, ele ajudou a desenvolver padrões para proteger os trabalhadores do amianto e da sílica. Ele lutou para proteger os trabalhadores da exposição ao ruído e lesões ergonômicas. E também atuou em áreas como segurança em zonas de trabalho, prevenção de quedas e melhoria do clima de segurança na construção civil. Ele é membro da American Industrial Hygiene Association e recebeu o prêmio William Steiger da American Conference Governmental Industrial Hygienists por suas contribuições para a área. Em 2019, ele recebeu o prêmio de responsabilidade social da AIHA. Scott, inicialmente queremos te agradecer por estar conosco e poder compartilhar seus conhecimentos e experiências sobre a gestão do amianto nas escolas dos Estados Unidos. Nos Estados Unidos, a primeira pergunta. Nos Estados Unidos, os cuidados com amianto nas escolas são mais rigorosos em relação a outras edificações? Que diferenças são essas? E o que levou a essa diferenciação?
Thank you, Gustavo. Well, in the U.S., we started regulating asbestos in the 1970s, but it really didn't become more strict until the 1980s. In 1983, 84, we put out regulations to protect workers who were working with asbestos or might be exposed to asbestos. But there was a lot of concern about the possible exposure of children to asbestos in the schools. And so Congress passed what's called the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, specifically to crack down on and regulate asbestos in schools. And I think, Congress did that in addition to the regulations for worker safety, because they wanted to make sure that students were protected. And that was the jurisdiction of the EPA. So they put together a committee, and we talked about, and I was on this committee as a technical advisor to look at how we should regulate it. And the difference is that in these buildings, because they're owned by the government, these are government buildings, mostly schools although it also applies to nonprofit schools, non-public schools. Because they were schools, what they do is they required that every school has to do a survey to find out where asbestos might be in their building if the building was built before a certain date. And then they have to develop a plan for how they're going to make sure that children are not exposed to the asbestos. And part of that plan was the EPA required training of all the workers who are either removing asbestos, disturbing asbestos, working in buildings as maintenance workers, and also the inspectors have to have special training, and the people that write the management plans have to have special training. So it was very comprehensive, but the focus really was on trying to protect children, since OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, only can regulate exposures to workers. I hope that answered your question, or I don't know if you have any follow-ups, but...
Em relação às obras de reforma e demolição, que não têm o objetivo de remoção do amianto, existe algum cuidado específico de identificação ou levantamento prévio de materiais contendo amianto nas escolas?
Yeah, I mean, EPA has some regulations specific to demolition work. If you're demolishing a building, you're expected to remove the asbestos ahead of time, and then remove and take care of the waste carefully and label it and put it in special landfills. That's for demolition work. Renovation work is the problem because so many of these buildings contain asbestos, and when the renovation workers, if the renovation workers don't know where the asbestos is, they're obviously going to disturb it, and it's going to spread throughout the building, and students can be exposed, and teachers. So what we did was we required that they have to identify where the asbestos is, and then the goal of the regulation is that you want to take care of the asbestos and make sure that any asbestos if the asbestos is in a public area where the students could disturb it, it should be removed because you don't have control over the students. We had instances in schools where you had pipes in a school classroom covered with asbestos, and the students would stick their pencils in it and start disturbing it. So that's not a good situation. So you have to, if it's in a public area, even in a gymnasium, students can take basketballs and bounce them off the ceiling, so it's very difficult to control exposure. So the goal is to remove the asbestos that's in public areas, and the only asbestos that should be left, that you can leave in place, should be in areas that are designated as restricted, only to train personnel, to maintenance workers who know where the asbestos is, and they can label it and make sure that it doesn't get disturbed. So really, with regard to renovation work, the renovation workers have to know where the asbestos is before they start. In the U.S., most renovation work in schools and demolition work is done in the summertime when the students aren't there. So they can close the whole building down and then just go in and do the removal work or do the renovation over the summer. But like I said, there's much stricter regulations for demolition work. But for renovation work, there's the school regulations, the asbestos in school regulations don't specifically say, here is exactly how you do this work. Here's how you remove a ceiling tile. Here's how you work, above, around asbestos. But there are some OSHA regulations that apply to that, the regulations that protect workers. And there also are these guidance documents, like the one I worked on with the National Institute of Building Sciences, that gives step-by-step procedures about how to do the work properly. I don't think there's a lot of enforcement to make sure that it's done properly, but there are lots of good procedures that could be followed. So,
for instance, in places in schools where only the staff has access, does the regulations treat these places differently?
Well, I think there's more. I think there's more. When the regulations came out and when EPA was dealing with school asbestos in schools, there's a lot of pushback from the industry and from the school districts. They didn't want to spend the money, to remove all the asbestos in schools. So they said, okay, we're going to leave it in place. And they made a lot of claims that if you remove asbestos, it's probably going to be done improperly and it'll contaminate the schools and it'd be very expensive to clean up. So they really pushed to allow for people to leave asbestos in schools, but only in those areas that were inaccessible to students and the public. So I think the question is, I don't know. I haven't seen any more studies done. I know there were studies done in the 80s showing asbestos disease among maintenance workers, but I haven't seen any studies in the last 2 decades about that. So I'm hoping that with the training that they were required to get, that they're taking care of the asbestos properly. But I don't really know how well it's enforced. One of the problems we have in the U.S. is that public employees, like school workers, are not covered by federal OSHA in half the states. Half the states, they're covered if the state has its own state-run OSHA program. But if it's not a state-run OSHA program, they're not covered by OSHA. So OSHA's not doing inspections there.
But there are other kinds of institutions caring for them, or not?
In terms of regulating or enforcement of standards, well, the EPA the EPA has some standards, but there's no detailed requirements about how to do the job properly. I mean, I think everybody hopes they're going to follow the OSHA regulations, because the OSHA regulations are very detailed. So,
all right. We will proceed to the next question. A comunidade escolar, pais, professores e alunos, teve algum papel para impulsionar e desenvolver a legislação que obriga o gerenciamento de materiais de contaminamento nas escolas?
Yeah, I mean, the parents' associations were very interested and very supportive, as were the teachers. And a lot of this was driven by the teacher unions, the sindicatos. They really were very supportive and very actively involved in crafting the regulations and the legislation. So yeah, they were. The students, I don't think the students had any role really, but the parents and the teachers unions were very active. Yeah, as well as the construction unions too.
Você poderia explicar como funciona na prática o princípio da gestão de materiais contendo amianto in place, ou no local? E ele se aplica também ao amianto friável?
I mean, back since the 1980s, we've made a distinction between friable asbestos, which can easily be crumbled if you hold it in your hand and crush it. It could become very dusty. And those materials that are not friable, like asbestos cement products. And as we were talking about earlier, the distinction is not always very clear, because even materials that are where the asbestos is solidly encapsulated in a hard material, and you think, oh, it can never be released to the air. But we know that when it gets damaged or cut or disposed of or demolished, it's going to become airborne. But under most circumstances, if it's in a building, if it's kept in good condition and away from the public, it's probably going to be okay. So the principle is basically to remove asbestos where it can't be controlled, where the public has access, where students could damage it, particularly, and friable materials are the most likely to be removed, or should be the highest priority for removal. But non-friable materials can probably be left in place, particularly if they're not accessible to the public or students. But having said that, they need, according to our regulations, to be inspected and checked to make sure that they're not getting damaged, that they're not becoming, that there's no chance of them releasing asbestos to the air. So, I mean, we have had situations where people were working in a warehouse and they're driving forklifts around, and as they drive, they bang into the walls, and that's not a good situation. If it's easy to get to, if it's easily accessible, it probably should be removed.
No caso de remoção, quem pode remover o amianto nos Estados Unidos, em particular nas escolas? E quais são os requisitos técnicos de formação, em termos de cursos e capacitações, necessários para o pessoal envolvido na remoção?
Well, when we drafted the asbestos in school regulations, we said that only trained people could do this work, could do the removal work, could do the inspections, could do the management, writing the management plans, could design the projects, monitor the projects. So in the regulations, we spelled out detailed requirements for every type of asbestos project worker. Like the workers have to have a 4-day class on how to handle asbestos in schools. And the regulations detail exactly what they have to be taught on or taught about the dangers of asbestos, how to do it properly, all the different techniques for removing asbestos. Like, for example, if you have a pipe insulation, we give them instructions on how to put a plastic bag over it, and then the bag has gloves, and you can do it inside of the bag, so there's less exposure. So all that's required, and every year the workers have to have a 1-day refresher class, because we were telling them that as they do the work, every year we learn more about the dangers of asbestos, and the techniques are evolving as well. So we required a 1-day refresher class every year. The contractors that are doing the work have to have a 5-day class, and they have to have a 1-day refresher every year. Inspectors, they have a 3-day class, etc. So it's very detailed requirements for training and certification of these workers. And the training of these workers and certification was left up to the states. Each state has their own system for administering these tests and to certifying and accrediting the training classes. So,
right, and there is a difference between the accreditation of people that will remove the asbestos and the people that will going to make the inspections in these buildings.
Yes, no, they have different training classes.
All right.
Right. And what happened was when OSHA updated their regulations in 1990 for workers, they adopted these same training requirements. They said, well, you have to follow the EPA training requirements for schools for all workers doing asbestos work in other buildings.
Quais são as etapas de remoção do amianto? Quais são os procedimentos técnicos e administrativos nas escolas dos Estados Unidos?
Well, as I said, I think the removal of asbestos is only done when the school's not in session. So it'll happen over the summer when the students aren't there. And usually what they do is, according to the OSHA regulations, they will seal off a room with plastic, and they will create a negative pressure environment there. So air cannot escape from this plastic barrier while the workers are in there, and they'll draw air out of there and filter it, so it creates so air can only flow into the room, and then the workers have to have a decontamination area. So when they come out of the area, they're wearing protective clothing. They have to have an area where they can take it off and shower, and then put on their street clothes and not contaminate them. So it's very, very restrictive. We don't really know. I mean, I think like there was some studies done looking at people taking showers when they come out of an asbestos removal job, and a lot of times people want to get home and they just sort of like put their head under the shower and then they go. That doesn't work. You have to really, and because the asbestos fibers, if you get them, in your hair or on your skin, you have to scrub to get them out. It's not that easy sometimes. But there was a lot of concern because there were studies showing that asbestos workers can take asbestos home on their clothing and then expose their family to it. And family members had gotten asbestos diseases from asbestos brought home on their clothing. So it's very, very restrictive, and that's why it's also very expensive. So, and school districts, by and large, are not, they don't have a lot of money, so they try to avoid doing removal work. And but because they don't, it's expensive to do it because of all the precautions that have to be taken. I don't know if you have any other questions about the removal process, but
Yes, I would like to know if the workers, if their health is monitored.
well, we did put a provision in the OSHA regulations that says that workers that are working with asbestos have to be offered medical exams. At the time when we wrote this regulation back in the 80s, we didn't really know how useful the exams were because Dr. Selikoff, who was the leading asbestos researcher, said, well, once they discover something in your lungs, it's too late. There's nothing you can do. But now there's new techniques, that what's called low dose CT scans, where you can identify asbestos disease very early on. And then you can treat workers, but also they can prevent future exposures, maybe changing and working in an area that doesn't have asbestos exposure. So there is a requirement for medical exams to be offered to workers. So,
Very well.
yeah.
E todas as escolas estão sujeitas à regulamentação AHERA ou AHERA? E gostaria de saber se há o cumprimento efetivo em todas as escolas.
Well, all schools are subject to AHERA. I mean, the public schools, the religious schools, the nonprofit schools. In terms of effective compliance, I don't know of any studies that have been done. I suspect there's probably some minimal compliance, but I doubt whether they're all complying effectively with it. Back in the 90s, I was going into schools in New York City and doing inspections. And some of the things they weren't very comprehensive sometimes in their inspections to know where it was. There was a lot of concern about how well the school systems were complying with it. And so I don't really know how much compliance there is right now, but I suspect it varies because I don't think there's a lot of inspectors checking on the schools. So I haven't seen any reports on that though. So I'm sorry, I don't really know the answer.
Okay, and if you're comfortable with answering, in your opinion, what states are ahead in this kind of compliance?
I really don't know how it varies from state to state. I mean, I don't know. And, a lot of it's up to the local school district. And that varies. Every school district is different. Some school districts are very small, others are enormous. New York City has like over 1,000 school buildings, and some of them still use coal-fired boiler, coal to heat their school buildings. So it's a lot of work to monitor and all these different school buildings. I mean, where I am in Montgomery County, outside of Washington, we have 250 schools, for 160,000 school children. So it's a big job, and I don't really know how many are in compliance, but I suspect there's some compliance. It's probably many schools are probably doing the minimum, but not going completely all the way that they should. I don't know.
Ok. Como são os cuidados no transporte e na destinação final dos materiais contendo amianto?
Yeah, that I think is much more regulated, and the EPA has very strict rules about how the asbestos needs to be handled, how it needs to be in sealed containers. They have to be labeled, and it has to be taken to a special type of landfill where it can be buried. But those regulations are not always followed. I mean, we hope that they are, but there were instances back in the 90s when it's expensive to dispose of asbestos because of all these precautions. So there were bags that were dumped, bags of asbestos dumped in the tunnels going into New York. They would just throw them off the back of the truck, but but I think that's rare. I think the asbestos industry has matured quite a bit, the removal industry, and I think they can get pretty high fines from EPA for improper disposal. So I think there's good compliance. I hope, I expect, but it's not always the case.
All right, can you give us a little bit more details on these fines, these kinds of fines in case of bad management of asbestos?
Yeah, I don't know how high the fines are, the EPA fines, but EPA fines can be very significant. OSHA fines are much lower though. Fines for violations of the worker protection rules. Um, so for OSHA fines, if it's a serious violation, it can be like $15,000 maybe, which isn't very much money. But if they could show that the employer knew that they were violating the law and did it intentionally, it can be 10 times that. It could be $150,000. One of the big problems has been for OSHA regulations and is that it's very rare for employers who violate the law to go to jail for violating the law. It happens, but it's very unusual. The criminal penalties, sending employers to jail for exposing people to asbestos, almost never happens. But the unions that I worked for were really pushing for stronger penalties and trying higher fines and for more criminal penalties. I think the maximum time you can go to jail for violating the OSHA law is 6 months. That's it. but uh, but there are some places like in Chicago and in Los Angeles and in New York where prosecutors are going after criminal corporations that are violating the law on purpose and really trying to make them pay. So I don't know, but I don't know the fines for EPA, but I think they're much higher than the OSHA fines.
Eu gostaria de saber se existe a população tem algum conhecimento sobre o risco do amianto e se existe algum programa ou campanha de conscientização sobre esses riscos.
Yeah, I think there is some awareness. It's not enough. I think there needs to be more awareness, and I don't know of any campaigns that are going on. I think there are so many other issues that have risen to the surface. Like now in the U.S., all everybody's talking about is trying to prevent workers from getting heat stress on the job. You know, and 10 years ago it was silica that we were worried about, and so people move on to the next problem. But I think asbestos is still a problem, but there's not enough awareness and not enough education about it. And there should be more campaigns about it. How is awareness in Brazil about asbestos?
In Brazil, there is some awareness about the dangers, but very inferior to what it should be, I believe. I believe most workers, mainly in construction, they work with very few precautions. They tend to break and do a lot of activities in the materials containing asbestos, and they A few of them know of the risks, but we are trying to change that.
Yeah, I think I would add one more thing, which is I think it's not just knowledge and awareness. There needs to be enforcement. There needs to be inspectors who go and make sure that it's done properly. And here in the US, we have very few inspectors and very little enforcement. And there is some enforcement, but not enough. And that's the problem. If it's not enforced, then the regulations are not going to be followed. So you figure in the US, with 360 million people, we have 2,000 OSHA inspectors for the whole country. That's nothing. It's very, very, very small.
Nós estamos chegando ao final dessa entrevista. Nós agradecemos muito pela sua participação. Haveria algum comentário, alguma consideração final, algum aspecto adicional a ser tratado, alguma recomendação?
Back in the 1980s, 1990s, there was a lot of attention to asbestos, a lot of concerns. And I think a lot of people became more aware of the problem. But I think, since the 1990s, the emphasis has changed and there's not as much awareness. I think there needs to be, because there's still a lot of asbestos in buildings, and there's not a lot being used anymore in the US or in Brazil. But this is a worldwide problem. It's not just a US problem or Brazil problem. And they're still exporting asbestos and mining it in Russia and Kazakhstan and China and using it, selling it in Indonesia and in Africa. So I think there needs to be a lot more awareness of the problem, particularly for people that are going in to do renovation work in buildings. Because a lot of times, if it's not labeled, if they don't know that where the asbestos is, if they're not aware of it, they're going to disturb it and they're going to get exposed. And we're going to continue to find, tens of thousands of deaths from asbestos disease every year. Probably not from asbestosis, which is mainly associated with high exposures, but from lung cancer, from mesothelioma. And that's why, the work to ban asbestos worldwide is so important. But that's just one facet. I think there needs to be a lot more emphasis for people that are renovating buildings that contain asbestos, buildings that were built before, say, 1980, that this can be a major problem. When the World Trade Center was built in New York, they sprayed asbestos on the columns to fireproof the towers. And when they were destroyed on 9/11, there was asbestos dust flown all over southern Manhattan because of that. So I think there's a significant problem that I think that we need to pay more attention to, particularly in the renovation of buildings that contain asbestos, buildings built before 1980.
All right, thank you very much, Scott. We now reached the end of this interview. We would like to know more about you here in Brazil, as you once came here, helping us raising our awareness of this issue here.
Yeah, I would be happy to come back and visit sometime. I hope.
Thank you very much.